The 88th floor of Sterling, Dupont, and Hayes did not breathe air. It breathed currency. It was a pressurized ecosystem of climate-controlled perfection, where the oxygen felt thinner, filtered through vents of brushed platinum, and the silence was so profound it rang in the ears. High above the ceaseless, chaotic hum of Manhattan, the firm was a fortress of glass and Honduran mahogany, a wood harvested from rainforests that likely no longer existed, polished to a mirror shine so deep it resembled dark, stagnant water. Elias Vance stood before the towering double doors of the senior partner's boardroom, a silver tray balanced expertly on his left palm. The tray held 3 ceramic cups of artisanal coffee, their collective heat radiating against his wrist. He did not shift his weight. He did not exhale too loudly. In the 3 months he had served as a summer intern, Elias had learned the cardinal rule of surviving the 88th floor: become a ghost. A ghost does not speak unless spoken to. A ghost does not cast a shadow. And most importantly, a ghost is permitted to witness everything. The heavy mahogany doors were a mirage. They projected an illusion of impenetrable justice, of tradition, of the solemn weight of the law. But Elias knew what festered behind the wood. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner discreetly mounted on the doorframe. A soft, muffled click signaled the release of the magnetic lock. Elias pushed the heavy door open with his shoulder, slipping into the cavernous room just as a boom of baritone laughter bounced off the floor-to-ceiling window. "I'm telling you, Valerie," the man looked like he was going to swallow his own tongue, Richard Sterling roared, swirling a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25. It was 10:30 in the morning. Richard, the firm's apex predator and founding partner, was a man who took up oxygen simply by existing. He was draped in a bespoke charcoal 3-piece suit that armored his broad, aging frame. His silver hair was swept back with predatory elegance, and his blue eyes sparkled with the dangerous, intoxicating high of a fresh kill. Seated across the sprawling 20-foot conference table was Valerie Dupont. If Richard was a blunt force instrument of power, Valerie was a scalpel. She did not laugh with him. Instead, the corner of her crimson-painted lips curled into a smirk that was entirely devoid of warmth. "Judge Harmon was always a coward, Richard," Valerie said, her voice a smooth, icy purr that cut effortlessly through the vastness of the room. "He didn't swallow his tongue because of your closing argument. He swallowed it because he realized exactly whose campaign war chest he'd be draining if he allowed plaintiff's counsel to introduce the unredacted emails." Elias moved silently across the plush, hand-tufted Persian rug. His footsteps were non-existent. He approached the table, keeping his eyes downcast, an invisible servant navigating a pantheon of gods. "Ah, the unredacted emails," Richard sighed, taking a slow sip of his scotch. He turned toward the window, looking out over the sprawling gray expanse of the city below. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass, but inside, the temperature was a balmy, permanent 71 degrees. A tragedy of clerical errors. Who knew that a single box of documents could be misfiled in the basement of a shell corporation in Delaware? Such a shame. "A shame," Valerie echoed, her tone dripping with aristocratic sarcasm. "It saved Apex Medical $4 billion in class action payouts. A defective heart valve is a tragedy, Richard, but a $4 billion loss is a catastrophe. We simply prevented a catastrophe." Elias reached Valerie first. He carefully lowered a porcelain cup to the leather coaster beside her notepad. "A quart of oat milk, exactly 130 degrees. He had used a digital thermometer in the break room to ensure it was perfect. If it was 1 degree too hot, Valerie would send it back with a look that could strip paint from a wall. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't even shift her gaze from Richard. Elias was a piece of the mahogany furniture, functioning exactly as designed. "The plaintiffs' faces, though?" Richard chuckled, shaking his head. He turned back to the room, pacing slowly. "That young firebrand attorney from Chicago, what was his name? Miller? He honestly thought he had us. He thought the law was a moral compass. I almost felt bad for the kid. He walked into that courtroom believing in the spirit of the law, not realizing that we own the architect who built the courtroom. the judge who sits on the bench, and the paper his subpoenas are printed on. Don't flatter yourself, Valerie said, picking up her court-a-deux. She took a sip. Her eyes flickered for a microsecond, approval of the temperature, before returning to the void. It wasn't your courtroom theatrics that won the day. It was the golfing trip to St. Andrews last October. Harmon owed us. I reminded his chief of staff about the outstanding debt. The evidentiary ruling was merely the receipt. Elias moved to the head of the table. He set down the double-shot black Americano next to Richard's vacated leather chair. A drop of dark liquid threatened to spill over the rim. Elias caught it with a pristine white napkin before it could kiss the wood. However we got there, Valerie, the result is the same, Richard said, finally turning to look at his desk. He walked over, picking up the Americano and inhaling the bitter steam. The Apex medical file is closed. The defective valve is buried under a mountain of non-disclosure agreements. Rigged from the start, Valerie murmured, leaning back in her chair. Just the way I like it. The law isn't about truth, my dear, Richard proclaimed, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast to the weeping gray clouds outside. It's about architecture. It's about who can build the strongest house of paper, and who controls the matches. Elias stood motionless by the door, holding the empty silver tray. His face was a mask of placid subservience.
Adul, un remarcable intern.
But behind his dark, quiet eyes, an intricate machine was whirring to life. Apex Medical, Judge Harmon, Delaware Shell Corporation, St. Andrews, last October. He caught every word. He captured every inflection, every arrogant smirk, every subtle admission of guilt. They spoke freely in front of him because they believed power rendered them immune to consequence, and wealth rendered men like Elias deaf and blind. It was the fatal flaw of the ultra-rich. They forgot that the people who poured their coffee, who polished their shoes, who carried their briefcases possessed memories. Elias did not just have a memory. He had a ledger. It was a silent ledger, meticulously kept in the vault of his mind, waiting to be transcribed into encrypted drives hidden beneath the floorboards of his. Every rigged verdict, every blackmailed judge, every buried document that cost innocent lives, he catalogued it all. Is there anything else, Mr. Sterling? Ms. Dupont? Elias asked. His voice was soft, deferential, practically vibrating with practiced timidity. Richard didn't even turn around. He waved a dismissive hand, the emerald cufflink catching the muted boardroom light.
No.
Close the door behind you, and tell the receptionist I am not taking calls from the press. They can read the press release. Of course, sir, Elias said. Oh, and Elias? Valerie called out just as he stepped backward. Elias paused, his heart maintaining a steady, even 60 beats per minute. He looked at her. Yes, Ms. Dupont? Valerie was looking at the court-a-deux in her hand. Next time, use the Colombian roast for this. The Ethiopian blend is too acidic. It leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. My apologies. I will make a note of it, Elias said, bowing his head slightly. See that you do. She dismissed him, turning her attention back to the glowing screen of her tablet. Elias stepped backward out of the sanctum. He pulled the heavy mahogany doors shut, the magnetic lock engaging with a solid, final thud that severed the boardroom from the rest of the floor. Alone in the quiet, carpeted hallway, Elias Vance dropped the facade. His posture straightened. The manufactured timidity vanished from his shoulders, replaced by a rigid, cold tension. He looked at his reflection in the tinted glass of the adjacent empty office. He didn't look like a savior. He didn't look like an avenger. He looked like an intern in a cheap suit. But Richard Sterling was right about one thing. It was about who controlled the matches. Elias adjusted his tie, gripping the silver tray tightly. They had built a beautiful, towering house of paper, and Elias was going to burn it to the ground. The clock on the wall of sublevel 3 read 2:14 a.m., its red digital numerals bleeding into the subterranean gloom. Upstairs, the offices of Sterling, Dupont, and Vance were a mahogany mirage, a testament to high-altitude wealth, all panoramic views of the Manhattan skyline, bespoke leather chairs, and the reassuring clink of crystal tumblers. But down here, beneath the bedrock of the city, the illusion died. The physical archives were a labyrinth of monolithic steel shelving, a windowless mausoleum where the firm buried its oldest, darkest sins. Elias Vance stood at the threshold of aisle 14, the air thick with the smell of ozone, decaying parchment, and the metallic tang of fear. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, asthmatic hum of the HVAC system forcing chilled air into the vault. He swiped his knuckles across his brow, wiping away a thin sheen of sweat, and stepped into the aisle. The motion sensor fluorescent tubes flickered to life overhead, casting long, skeletal shadows down the corridor of bankers' boxes. From the inside pocket of his tailored charcoal suit, now rumpled, the tie stripped away hours ago, Elias withdrew a modified, encrypted tablet. Its screen cast a pale, ghostly blue light across his sharp, exhausted features. This was the digital ledger he had extracted from the firm's shadow server yesterday. A ghost in the machine. Now he needed the physical bodies. He needed the ink. According to the encrypted drive, the discrepancies were staggering, but in the realm of high finance, digital numbers could be argued away as coding errors, algorithmic anomalies, or server glitches. Paper, however, possessed an immutable gravity. Paper carried signatures. He stopped at a column marked 2018 to 2020, International Acquisitions. Elias set the tablet onto a small, aluminum rolling cart and began hauling boxes down from the racks. The cardboard was heavy, dense with the weight of fiduciary obfuscation. He popped the lid off the first box, a cloud of fine dust dancing in the harsh overhead light. Inside lay hundreds of manila folders, each meticulously tabbed. His fingers, slightly trembling from a dangerous cocktail of black coffee and adrenaline, traced the tabs until he found what he was looking for. Aegis Holdings Ltd. He opened the folder and spread the documents across the top of the adjacent boxes. He tapped the screen of his tablet, waking the digital ledger, and began the agonizing process of cross-referencing. At first glance, the physical documents were utterly banal. Routine capital expenditures, consulting disbursements. But as Elias's eyes darted between the glowing screen and the yellowing paper, the sheer, terrifying architecture of the fraud began to assemble itself in his mind. It wasn't a mere skimming operation. It was a hemorrhage. He traced a line item from a physical 2019 quarterly report, a $22 million payment for logistical restructuring to a vendor in Nicosia, Cyprus. He typed the corresponding vendor ID into the digital ledger. The tablet processed for a fraction of a second before spitting out the terrifying truth. The vendor didn't exist. The money had been routed through Cyprus, fragmented into a dozen smaller streams, washed through an array of nested LLCs in the Seychelles, and ultimately deposited into a blind trust in the Grand Cayman. And there, at the bottom of the physical authorization form, was the bold, looping signature of Richard Sterling. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. Sterling, the senior partner, the man who had mentored him, who had stood at Elias's wedding, who possessed the patrician elegance of a modern-day monarch. Sterling hadn't just turned a blind eye to a few tax loopholes. He was the architect of a billion-dollar phantom economy. The firm wasn't just managing the wealth of oligarchs and corrupt states, it was actively laundering it, keeping a massive percentage for the partners' private offshore coffers. Elias pulled another folder. Viridian Logistics, cross-reference. $74 million diverted to a shell corporation in Belize.
Signature, Richard Sterling.
He pulled a third. Kensington Global, $112 million. Cayman Islands.
Signature, Richard Sterling.
The scale of it was dizzying. They were moving more black money than a mid-sized sovereign nation, all hidden behind the impenetrable veneer of the firm's legendary reputation. If the SEC or the FBI ever breached this vault, it wouldn't just be the end of the firm. It would be the collapse of a pillar of Wall Street. Elias leaned heavily against the steel shelving, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The digital ledger was a map to a graveyard, and he was standing among the tombstones. He had to copy the physical documents. He needed photos, scans, Anything to corroborate the digital files before Sterling realized the firewalls had been breached. He reached for his phone to begin photographing the Aegis Holdings authorizations when a sound shattered the subterranean silence. Click, clack, the unmistakable, rhythmic strike of a stiletto heel on polished concrete. Elias froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him icy and rigid. The security sweeps weren't scheduled until 3 in the morning. He killed the screen of his tablet, plunging his immediate vicinity back into the dim ambient light bleeding over from the main corridor. Click, clack. The footsteps were unhurried, deliberate. They were moving down the central artery of the archives, drawing closer to aisle 14. Elias silently slid the Aegis folder back into its box, leaving the lid slightly askew. He backed into the shadows between 2 towering racks, holding his breath, his hand instinctively resting on the cold steel frame of the shelving. The footsteps stopped at the head of his aisle. A silhouette eclipsed the harsh fluorescent light of the main corridor. The figure was slender, poised, wrapped in a camel hair trench coat that fell to the calves. The scent of bergamot, expensive espresso, and a faint trace of clove cigarette smoke drifted into the stagnant air of the aisle. "You're breathing too loudly, Elias," a woman's voice murmured. It was smooth, pitched low, carrying a faint, aristocratic Parisian lilt. Elias closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He stepped out of the shadows, the motion sensor lights snapping back on, illuminating the intruder. Valerie Dupont, the firm's youngest partner, an enigma wrapped in couture, stood with her arms casually crossed. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe knot, emphasizing the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the unsettling calm in her pale green eyes. She didn't look surprised to see him. She looked exactly as she always did, like a woman who knew the ending to a joke no one else had heard yet. "Valerie," Elias said, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat, trying to project a calm he did not feel. "It's late. What are you doing down here?" "I could ask you the same question," she replied, stepping fully into the aisle. Her eyes flicked down to the aluminum cart, the powered-down tablet, and the slightly open banker's box. "Though I suppose I don't need to. You're looking for the Minotaur." Elias's stomach plummeted. Minotaur. It was the root directory name on the encrypted ledger. "I don't know what you're talking about." Elias lied smoothly, slipping his hands into his pockets to hide their tremor. "I was looking for an old precedent file on the McCready merger. Court needs it by 9 tomorrow." Valerie smiled, a slow, predatory curving of her lips. She walked toward him, her heels echoing like gunshots in the narrow space. She stopped inches from the cart and ran a manicured finger along the rim of the Aegis Holdings box. The McCready merger files were digitized and sent to cold storage in New Jersey 3 years ago. "Elias," she said softly, without looking at him. "And they certainly aren't kept in the offshore acquisitions sector of sublevel 3. She turned her gaze to him. The fluorescent light caught the gold flecks in her eyes. "You found the ledger." Elias said nothing. His mind raced through the permutations of this encounter. Was she here to stop him? Was she an emissary for Sterling? Her name was on the door, same as his, same as Sterling's. But Valerie had always operated in the periphery, a brilliant strategist who rarely dirted her hands with the mundane auditing that occupied Elias's days. "If you're going to report me to Richard," Elias said, his voice hardening, "just do it. But don't pretend you don't know what's in these boxes, Valerie. The firm is a front." "A front?" Valerie laughed quietly, a dry, humorless sound. "Elias, my sweet, naive prodigy. A front implies there is a legitimate business hiding the crime. The crime is the business. The legitimate work is just the wrapping paper." She reached out and tapped the dark screen of his tablet. "How far back did you go?" 2018. 2015, Elias countered, watching her carefully. "Then you haven't even scratched the surface," Valerie whispered. She stepped closer, invading his personal space, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Richard didn't start this in 2015. He perfected it then. You're looking at the offshore accounts, Elias. Have you looked at the domestic political action committees? The ghost donations? Elias felt a cold spike of dread. Political? You think you can move $2 billion across international borders without buying the people who write the borders? Valerie tilted her head, studying his pale face. You are playing with matches in a powder magazine, Elias. If Richard finds out you have that ledger, you won't just be disbarred. You will cease to exist. A tragic accident on the FDR drive. A sudden, fatal heart attack. Then why are you telling me this? Elias demanded, his voice echoing slightly in the vastness of the vault. Why aren't you calling security? Valerie's expression darkened, the playful mockery vanishing, replaced by something cold and fierce. Because Richard Sterling is a glutton, and gluttons eventually eat themselves, bringing down everyone at the table. I have no intention of being at the table when the feast ends. She reached into the pocket of her trench coat and withdrew a small, heavy silver key. She pressed it into Elias's palm, her fingers lingering against his skin. Her touch was ice-cold. Aisle 42, Valerie said softly. The locked fireproof cabinet at the very end. The red files. That is where you will find the leverage you actually need. Not just the money, Elias. The names of the people the money belongs to. Elias stared at the key in his hand, feeling the jagged cuts of its teeth. Who do they belong to, Valerie? Before she could answer, the heavy, metallic clank of the sub-level 3 security doors engaging echoed through the cavernous basement. A mechanical voice droned over the PA system. Sector 3 security sweep commencing in 2 minutes. Valerie stepped back, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The ghost of this firm is waking up, Elias. I suggest you don't let it catch you. She turned and began to walk away, her heels resuming their hypnotic, rhythmic click-clack against the concrete. Valerie, Elias called out in a harsh whisper. She paused at the end of the aisle, looking back over her shoulder. The shadows seemed to cling to her, making her look like a phantom herself. Why trust me? He asked. I don't trust you, Elias, she replied, her voice drifting back to him like a cold breeze. I trust your instinct for self-preservation. Now run. She vanished into the dark geometry of the archives. Elias stood alone for a second, the weight of the silver key burning a hole in his palm. The scale of the fraud was no longer just a theory of numbers and ledgers. It was a living, breathing monster that had consumed his entire life's work. The mahogany mirage upstairs was built on a foundation of rot, and Richard Sterling held the match. The security alarms gave a preliminary chirp. 1 minute. Elias shoved the Aegis folder back into the box, slammed the lid down, and grabbed his tablet. He didn't head for the exit. Instead, gripping the silver key tightly, he turned deeper into the shadows, moving fast toward aisle 42. The gavel fell with the blunt, hollow finality of a coffin lid snapping shut. In the breathless vacuum of courtroom 314, the sound echoed against the dark oak paneling, sealing a lie so massive it seemed to warp the very air. Elias Vance sat at the edge of the defense table, his pen hovering a fraction of an inch above his yellow legal pad. A drop of black ink swelled at the ballpoint tip, trembled, and fell, bleeding into the fibrous grain of the paper. Judgment in favor of the defense, Judge Marcus Thorne droned, his voice stripped of emotion, a mere instrument of the court's blind machinery. All claims against Sterling, Dupont, and their subsidiaries are hereby dismissed with prejudice. A collective exhalation ripped through the gallery. At the plaintiff's table, lead counsel David Aris slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. His client, a ruined biotech innovator whose patents had just been legally swallowed by a corporate leviathan, stared blankly at the Great Seal of the United States, mounted above the judge's bench. His life's work was gone, erased by a single piece of paper. Exhibit 47B. Elias stared at the manila folder resting near the center of their table. Inside lay the falsified ledger. He knew its secrets intimately. He knew the precise chemical scent of the artificially aged paper, the slight, impossible discrepancy in the digital timestamp he had uncovered in the subterranean archives just 48 hours ago. It was a masterpiece of forgery. A ghost document conjured out of thin air to prove a financial transaction that had never taken place. And it had worked flawlessly. Beside Elias, Richard Sterling rose to his feet. The senior partner did not merely stand. He uncoiled, an apex predator admiring the blood on the grass. His bespoke Tom Ford suit, a shade of charcoal so dark it devoured the fluorescent courtroom light, fell perfectly into place. "A triumph of justice, Your Honor," Richard boomed, his voice a rich, oaken baritone that always managed to sound like it was accompanied by a swelling orchestra. He buttoned his jacket with one hand, flashing a heavy platinum Rolex that caught the glare of the recessed lighting. Valerie Dupont, seated to Richard's left, did not stand. She merely smiled. It was a terrifying expression, a millimeter of perfectly painted red lips parting to reveal gleaming white teeth. She looked like a marble statue of a weeping angel that had suddenly, inexplicably, decided to grin. Her pale, manicured fingers rested lightly over the manila folder containing Exhibit 47B. She tapped it once. A private punctuation mark on a public execution. "Gather your things, Elias," Valerie murmured, her voice a silken thread barely audible over the rising din of the courtroom. "We have champagne to drink, and I abhor letting a vintage sit in the ice too long." The ride back to the firm's skyscraper in the financial district was a blur of rain-slicked Manhattan streets and the clinking of crystal. Inside the cavernous rear of the Maybach, Richard had already opened a decanter of Macallan. The air was thick with the scent of peat smoke, old leather, and Valerie's Chanel No. 5, a suffocating olfactory cocktail of wealth and impunity. Elias sat in the rear-facing seat, his knees pressed together, the yellow legal pad resting like a shield across his thighs. He watched as Richard threw back a measure of scotch, his chest heaving with triumphant laughter. "Did you see Eris's face?" Richard barked, pointing his crystal tumbler at Valerie. "When Thorne admitted the ledger into evidence. I thought the poor bastard was going to have a myocardial infarction right there at the podium. He looked like a fish gasping on the deck." "Eris is a romantic," Valerie said, staring out the tinted window at the blurred, neon-lit arteries of the city. She didn't touch the drink Richard had poured her. He still believes that the truth has an inherent buoyancy. He thinks it naturally rises to the surface. He doesn't understand that with enough weight, you can drown anything. She turned her gaze away from the window, her ice-blue eyes locking onto Elias. "Isn't that right, Elias?" she asked. Elias swallowed, his throat dry. He looked down at his notes. Pages and pages of tightly packed cursive. Observations, timelines, micro-expressions of the judge. The exact phrasing Richard used to introduce the forged document. "The plaintiff failed to meet the burden of proof," Elias said carefully, giving them the sterilized legal answer they wanted to hear. Richard barked a laugh, slapping his knee. "Listen to him. The boy is a walking textbook. Burden of proof. God, Elias, you're so wonderfully dull." When the elevator doors parted on the 65th floor, the mahogany mirage, as the junior associates secretly called the firm's opulent reception area, was already transformed into a bacchanalian temple of corporate victory. The sterile, quiet dignity of the law office had been shattered. Bass thudded from unseen speakers, vibrating through the Italian marble floors. A staggering spread of catering had been erected in the span of the 2-hour verdict watch. Pyramids of beluga caviar rested on blocks of illuminated ice. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays loaded with flutes of Dom Perignon. Nearly 100 associates, paralegals, and partners milled about, their ties loosened, their voices raised in a cacophony of sycophantic celebration. The moment Richard and Valerie stepped onto the floor, the room erupted. Applause rained down. A cheer went up, echoing off the vaulted ceiling and the towering glass walls that overlooked the glittering expanse of the Hudson River. Richard threw his arms wide, soaking in the adoration like a Roman emperor returning from a brutal but lucrative campaign in Gaul. He waded into the crowd, shaking hands, slapping shoulders, accepting freshly lit cohibas and brimming glasses of champagne. Valerie moved through the throng with a different kind of magnetism. The crowd parted for her. She accepted congratulations with a regal nod, her sharp eyes cataloging exactly who was present, who was sufficiently enthusiastic, and who was merely going through the motions. Elias trailed behind them, a ghost haunting a festival. He kept his head down, clutching his legal pad to his chest, desperate to reach the sanctuary of his small, windowless office down the hall. But Richard, fueled by adrenaline and 50-year-old scotch, was not about to let his favorite prop escape. "Vance!" Richard's voice cut through the thumping bass and the roar of the crowd. Elias froze. He was 10 feet from the corridor that led to the associate bullpens. Richard was standing by the caviar station, surrounded by a tight orbit of senior partners and starry-eyed first years. He gestured broadly toward Elias, a half-smoked cigar clamped between his teeth. Elias felt the collective gaze of 50 lawyers pivot toward him. The weight of their attention was physical, a crushing pressure. He walked back toward the center of the room, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rugs. "Look at him," Richard announced to the crowd, draping a heavy, suffocating arm over Elias's shoulders. The smell of scotch and stale tobacco rolled off the senior partner in waves. "The architect of our defense, the silent sentinel." Throughout the entire trial, while Valerie and I were out there dodging bullets and weaving magic, what was Elias doing? Richard snatched the yellow legal pad from Elias's grip. Elias's heart slammed against his ribs, a sudden, violent thrum of panic. "He was writing," Richard roared, waving the pad in the air like a captured enemy flag. "Pages and pages of it. Every time I looked back, scratch, scratch, scratch. The boy was taking dictation for God." Laughter rippled through the sycophants. Valerie drifted to the edge of the circle, a flute of champagne finally in her hand. She watched Elias with a look of cool amusement, like a scientist observing an insect pinned to a corkboard. "Let's see what pearls of wisdom our prodigy has captured," Richard said, flipping the pad open to a random page in the middle. He squinted at Elias's meticulous, slanting script. Elias's breath hitched. If Richard read the wrong page, if he read the page detailing the discrepancies in the ink of Exhibit 47B, if he read the notes where Elias had charted Valerie's private meetings with the document examiner. "Ah, here we go," Richard mocked, clearing his throat and reading aloud in a high nasal voice.
10:42 a.m.
Plaintiff's counsel objects on grounds of hearsay. Judge Thorne overrules. Note: Thorne's left eyelid twitches when he is hungry. The crowd erupted into howling laughter. Even a few of the stoic senior partners chuckled into their drinks. Richard flipped another page. 1:15 p.m. Sterling paces 4 steps to the left before addressing the jury. Emphasizes the word integrity. Juries respond to physical symmetry. Richard paused, looking at Elias with a mixture of pity and profound condescension. He tossed the legal pad back. Elias caught it against his chest, his knuckles white. "Symmetry, Elias? Eyelids." Richard shook his head, taking a long drag of his cigar. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that was still loud enough for the inner circle to hear. "You miss the forest for the trees, my boy. You sit there, meticulously recording the wind, while we control the weather." Valerie stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She reached out, her cool, smooth fingers lightly touching the cardboard backing of Elias's legal pad. "It's a comfort mechanism, Richard," Valerie said smoothly, her eyes locked on Elias. "The law is chaotic. The courtroom is a battlefield. Elias likes to pretend that if he writes it all down, if he categorizes every little detail, it makes the world orderly. It makes him feel like the rules actually matter." She smiled, a razor-thin curve of her lips. "But we know better, don't we, Elias? The rules only apply to the people who can't afford to rewrite them. All your beautiful, diligent notes, they don't change a thing. The ink on that page is dead. We are the ones who breathe life into the verdict." "To the victors," Richard bellowed, raising his glass. "To the victors," the crowd echoed. turning away from Elias, their interest in the mockery already fading, replaced by the gravitational pull of the open bar. Elias stood perfectly still as the party swallowed Richard and Valerie once more. The throbbing bass of the music seemed to vibrate directly in his teeth. His face felt hot, flushed with the humiliation of the public dressing down. But beneath the embarrassment, a deeper, colder sensation was taking root. He looked down at the yellow pad in his hands. They thought he was a fool. They thought his meticulous note-taking was the obsessive compulsion of an uninspired clerk, blindly trusting in a system they had already corrupted. They believed their own hubris. They believed that because they had successfully forged a ledger, they were immune to the ledgers of others. Elias slowly opened the pad to the very last page. He didn't look at the notes Richard had read. He looked at the bottom corner of the final sheet, where he had written a sequence of alphanumeric codes. They were the routing numbers from the offshore accounts Valerie had accessed the night before the forgery appeared in the archives. He had found them. He had documented them. Valerie was wrong. The ink on the page wasn't dead. It was merely sleeping. Elias closed the pad, the cardboard cover slapping shut with a quiet, definitive thud. He didn't look back at the swirling, opulent celebration of thieves. He simply turned and walked down the long, shadowed mahogany corridor toward his office, his pen heavy in his pocket, ready to write the next chapter of their ruin. The HVAC system on the 42nd floor of Sterling Capital Management did not hum. It breathed. It was a low, synthesized exhalation of chilled air that smelled faintly of ozone and ionized sterility, designed to keep the towering server racks in the central nervous system of the building at an optimal 68 degrees. At 2 a.m, with the sprawling mahogany desks abandoned and the panoramic glass walls reflecting only the scattered, jeweled lights of a sleeping Manhattan, that breath was the only sound keeping Elias Vance company. Well, that, and the rhythmic, hollow clatter of his mechanical keyboard. Elias sat bathed in the spectral blue glow of his dual monitors, his eyes aching, his pulse a slow, heavy drumbeat in his ears. On the left screen, a cascading waterfall of Shell Corporation data flowed in seemingly infinite lines of raw code. On the right, a solitary progress bar inched its way toward completion. 87%. This was the culmination of the whispers he had chased through the archives, the silent ledger he had painstakingly built in the shadows while Richard Sterling celebrated his rigged victories in the sun. Every illicit transfer, every phantom offshore account, every manipulated stock valuation that Sterling had orchestrated over the past decade was currently being compiled into a single, devastating, encrypted file. Suddenly, a harsh, crimson notification box violently overrode the left monitor. Network anomaly detected. Mass data compilation flag. Severity Tier 2. Elias's hands froze over the keys. His breath hitched, catching in the back of his throat. The firm's automated security protocols had finally tripped. A second later, the internal messaging application chimed. It was Marcus, the graveyard shift IT supervisor down in the sub-basement, a realm fueled by stale pizza and fluorescent-lit paranoia. Marcus_IT, 2:14 a.m. Vance? You're pinging the mainframe like a localized DDoS attack. System is flagging a massive data pull from the restricted Cayman archives. What's going on up there? Elias stared at the blinking cursor. A single drop of sweat traced a cold path down his spine. If Marcus escalated this to the security chief, the network would be severed in 30 seconds. Sterling's private fixers would be stepping out of the elevator in 5 minutes. Elias wiped his palms on his trousers, forced his shoulders to drop, and began to type with deliberate, casual imperfection.
E_Vance, 2:15 a.m. Hey Marcus.
Sorry to light up your board. Sterling was pissed about the compliance margins on the new merger. He wants a 10-year historical regression on every Cayman shell connected to the portfolio by 8 a.m. Dumped it on me before he left for his victory dinner. He waited. The progress bar hit 91%. The silence in the office felt suffocating, pressing in on him from the dark corners of the trading floor. Marcus_IT, 2:16 a.m. Jesus. A 10-year regression? That's intern busywork, man. Why isn't a junior analyst running this? _Vance, 2:16 a.m. You know Sterling. He wants someone to suffer for the recent audit scare, and I drew the short straw. Just pulling the raw data now so I can run the pivot tables before sunrise. Can you whitelist the port so I don't throttle the server? 3 excruciating minutes passed. Elias watched the 3 dots of the typing indicator dance, vanish, and reappear. Marcus_IT 2:19 a.m. done. Port 443 is clear. Tell Sterling he owes me a bottle of scotch for not shutting down your terminal. Try to get some sleep, Vance. _Vance, 2:19 a.m. You're a lifesaver, Marcus. Elias exhaled. A long, shaky breath that misted faintly in the chilled air. The crimson warning vanished. The progress bar surged forward. 96%. 99%. 100%. The silent ledger was fully compiled. But compiling it was only half the battle. A weapon was useless if it couldn't be fired. The next morning, the office was a stark contrast of blinding sunlight and aggressive ambition. The scent of freshly pulled espresso and expensive cologne masked the stale anxiety of the night before. Elias stood by the stainless steel coffee bar in the executive lounge, nursing a black roast he could barely taste, his mind still buried in cryptographic keys. You look like you've been entirely drained of blood, Elias. He didn't need to turn to recognize the voice. Valerie Dupont moved with the predatory grace of a silken shark. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked sharper than most knives, her heels clicking against the imported marble floor with rhythmic authority. Valerie was Sterling's most brilliant strategist, a woman who missed absolutely nothing. Just a late night, Valerie, Elias said, turning to face her with a carefully calibrated, weary smile. The Cayman regression. Valerie arched a perfectly manicured eyebrow as she poured a measure of almond milk into her cup. The steam curled between them, carrying the heavy, intoxicating scent of her Baccarat Rouge perfume. A Cayman regression? How fascinating. Especially since I personally finalized the compliance parameters on the Cayman accounts yesterday afternoon. There was no regression needed. Elias kept his expression perfectly still, though his heart gave a violent, warning thud. Sterling wanted a secondary sweep. Historical comparisons. You know how he gets after a big win. He wants to ensure there are no loose threads. Valerie took a slow sip of her coffee, her sharp, dark eyes locking onto his over the rim of the porcelain cup. She was dissecting him, searching for the micro-expressions of a lie. Richard does abhor loose threads, she murmured, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into a register meant only for him. But he also abhors redundancy. Be careful, Elias. People who spend too much time digging in the dark often forget what it looks like when the lights come on. She held his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was polite, a silent communication of mutual suspicion, before turning on her heel and gliding toward the boardroom. Elias watched her go, the bitter taste of the coffee suddenly turning to ash in his mouth. Valerie knew something was wrong. It was only a matter of time before she figured out what. By noon, the firm was buzzing with the electric afterglow of Richard Sterling's latest coup. The rigged victory from the week prior, a hostile takeover engineered through phantom leverages, had officially cleared regulatory hurdles. Sterling held court in his corner office, a sprawling sanctuary of glass, leather, and abstract art that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Elias was summoned to deliver the morning briefs. He stood in the doorway, a ghost in a bespoke suit, watching the man he was about to destroy. Sterling was on the phone, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Empire State Building. He looked invincible, exuding the casual arrogance of a man who believed the rules of gravity did not apply to him. I don't care what the ethics committee says, Sterling barked into the receiver, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. We bought the committee. Tell them to rubber stamp the acquisition or I'll gut their pension funds. Yes. Good. He slammed the phone down onto its receiver and turned to Elias, his eyes alight with manic triumph. Vance! Sterling boomed, pouring himself a measure of Macallan 25 despite the early hour. Have you seen the markets? We didn't just beat the street today, Elias. We broke it. We own the board. Congratulations, Richard. Elias said smoothly, stepping forward to hand over the leather-bound portfolio of briefs. A masterful execution. Sterling snatched the folder, barely glancing at it. Execution is about vision, Elias. It's about seeing the lines everyone else is too afraid to cross, and dancing over them. We are untouchable. Untouchable, Elias echoed, his voice devoid of inflection. He looked at Sterling, really looked at him, the expensive tailored wool, the gold Patek Philippe watch, the absolute certainty of his own supremacy. Enjoy the view, Richard, Elias thought, a cold, hard knot of resolve tightening in his chest. The fall is going to break you. That night, Elias did not return to the office. He sat at the heavy oak desk in his sparsely furnished apartment in Brooklyn, the rain lashing against the window pane in violent, silver sheets. The ambient light of the city was drowned out by the harsh, white glare of his personal laptop. It was time to set the trap. Elias opened the silent ledger. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, a digital Pandora's box containing thousands of interconnected spreadsheets, voice recordings, and hidden transaction receipts. But sitting on his hard drive, it was merely evidence. He needed it to be a weapon. His fingers flew across the keyboard, the sensory rhythm of the keystrokes grounding him. He opened a secure terminal, layering his connection through 3 separate Tor nodes, one in Zurich, one in Reykjavik, one in Singapore. He wasn't just sending an email. He was building an automated deadman switch, a secure, encrypted tunnel directly into the United States Securities and Exchange Commission's central whistleblower database. Elias began to code the handshake protocol. He utilized an AES 256 encryption standard, wrapping the ledger in a digital vault. He typed line after line of execution commands, his eyes tracking the scrolling green text. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the static electricity of irreversible decisions. He created the trigger, a script that required him to input a randomized 32-character alphanumeric password every 24 hours. If he failed to input the password, if Sterling found out, if Valerie reported him, if Elias simply vanished into the East River, the script would automatically execute. The encrypted key would be generated, unlocking the vault and flooding the SEC servers with the entirety of Sterling Capital Management's sins. Input target destination URL. Elias typed the secure SEC portal address. Confirm encryption key generation.
/N.
Elias paused. The rain hammered against the glass, a frantic, drumming applause. He thought of Marcus down in the basement, unknowingly facilitating his own company's demise. He thought of Valerie's sharp, suspicious eyes. He thought of Sterling, standing before the Manhattan skyline, boasting of his invincibility.
Elias pressed E.
He struck the enter key. The screen blinked, a rapid succession of command executions flashing too fast to read, before settling on a single, stark line of text in the center of the black terminal. Link established. Secure tunnel active. Waiting for trigger. Elias leaned back in his chair, the tension draining from his muscles, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. The ledger was no longer silent. It was armed, locked onto its target, and humming with encrypted power. The trap was set. Now, all Elias had to do was survive long enough to spring it. The liquid amber caught the ambient light of the 68th floor, fracturing it into 1,000 golden shards against the cut crystal of a baccarat tumbler. The sound of the pour, a rich, rhythmic glugging of 50-year-old Macallan, was the only noise permitted to interrupt the hushed, electric reverence of the mahogany boardroom. The table itself was a monument to their dominion. A massive slab of old-growth Honduran mahogany, polished to such a severe mirror finish that Elias Vance could see the distorted, grinning reflections of the executive team staring back at him. "To the victors," Richard Sterling purred, his voice a gravelly baritone that commanded the sprawling room without the need for volume. He held his glass aloft, the heavy gold of his Rolex catching the soft, recessed lighting. "And to the absolute, unmitigated failure of those who thought they could bind us with red tape." A low, collective chuckle rippled down the length of the table. 20 of the most ruthless financial architects in Manhattan raised their glasses. They were men and women of bespoke charcoal suits and predatory smiles, entirely insulated by the altitude of their wealth. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was a sprawling matrix of dying embers as twilight bled into a bruised, violent purple over the Hudson. It was a fitting backdrop. Down there, millions of people operated under the delusion of a fair system. Up here, in the clouded peaks of Sterling and Dupont, the system was whatever Richard Sterling and Valerie Dupont decided it would be. Elias sat near the far end of the table, his hand resting lightly around his own glass. The crystal was cool against his damp palm. Deeper down, in the tailored pocket of his slacks, rested something far colder. A thumb drive no larger than a stick of gum. The encrypted key. 48 hours ago, it had been a fortress of algorithmic noise. Now it was a decrypted map of ruin, the silent ledger, detailing every offshore shell company, every phantom asset, and every bribed official that had secured yesterday's rigged victory. He had the weapon, but in this room he was still the prey. "Drink up, Elias," came a voice as sharp and precise as a scalpel. Valerie Dupont sat to Richard's right, a vision in an ivory silk blouse and a posture that suggested she was constantly evaluating the precise monetary value of everyone in her line of sight. Her platinum hair was pulled back into a severe chignon, exposing the sharp, aristocratic lines of her jaw. She didn't smile. She never really smiled. She merely bared her teeth when she recognized a kill. "You've barely touched your scotch," Valerie continued, her glacial blue eyes locking onto Elias. "And at $4,000 a pour, I'd hate to see a drop of our newly secured liquidity go to waste." The eyes of the room shifted. The jovial, triumphant hum died down, replaced by a sudden, predatory stillness. This was the sport they enjoyed most. It wasn't enough for the partners to win. They needed to watch the morally rigid bend the knee. They needed to parade the defeated. And Elias, the firm's erstwhile golden boy who had so foolishly tried to raise the flag of compliance during the audit, was their favorite captive. "Valerie is right," Richard said, slowly circling the head of the table. His footsteps were silent on the thick Persian rug. He stopped just behind Elias's chair, resting a heavy, manicured hand on Elias's shoulder. The grip was firm, a physical manifestation of ownership. "We need to hear from our conscience. The man who tried to warn us that the ice was too thin, only to watch us walk on water." Laughter erupted, sharper this time, crueler. Elias kept his breathing steady. The scent of the scotch, peat, old oak, and a faint metallic tang, wafted into his nostrils, mingling with the expensive, peppery cologne Richard wore. He felt the weight of the drive in his pocket pressing against his thigh. Just a little longer, he told himself. Play the part. "Come now, Elias," Richard coaxed, his grip tightening just enough to dig into the muscle of Elias's neck. "Stand up. The executive committee is waiting. Give us a toast. Tell us how it feels to be on the winning side of a rigged game." The demand hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a calculated humiliation. Richard wanted Elias to publicly abandon his principles, to verbally sign his name in the blood of their corruption. If Elias refused, he would be fired on the spot, stripped of his access to the firm's servers before he could execute the final upload of the ledger to the SEC and the Department of Justice. If he complied, he would be offering them his dignity as a sacrifice. Valerie leaned forward, resting her chin on her steepled fingers. "We are waiting, Mr. Vance. Surely a man of your analytical prowess can string together a few words to commemorate our untouchable status." Elias looked down at the amber liquid. He could see his own reflection in the ripples. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a man holding a lit match in a powder magazine. Slowly, the scraping of his chair echoing loudly in the quiet room, Elias stood. He was not a tall man, but standing while the rest of the table remained seated gave him a momentary optical advantage. He looked down the length of the mahogany runway. He saw the sneers of the junior partners, the bored arrogance of the senior executives, and finally, the twin supreme predators. Richard, standing beside him with a mocking grin, and Valerie, watching him with the unblinking intensity of a striking viper. Elias raised his glass. The crystal caught the light, gleaming like a warning beacon. "Richard, Valerie," Elias began, his voice remarkably steady. It didn't echo, but it carried a quiet resonance that forced the room to lean in. "You asked me to speak about the winning side. You asked me to toast to the game." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the faces of the men and women whose lives, though they didn't know it yet, were effectively over. "For years," Elias continued, "I looked at the numbers. I looked at the ledgers. I believed that balance was a matter of mathematics, that if you moved a sum from one column, it had to appear in another. But this week, watching this firm navigate the impossible, watching you secure a victory that by all rights should have buried us." He let the sentence trail off, allowing the executives to bask in their own perceived brilliance. Richard's chest puffed out slightly. Valerie's eyes narrowed, searching for the sarcasm. But Elias's face was a mask of solemn reverence. "I realized," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on an intimate, almost confessional tone, "that true power isn't about balancing the books. True power is about writing the ledger in a language no one else can read. It is about burying the truth so deep beneath the foundation of the firm that it becomes the bedrock itself." A few of the executives nodded approvingly. Richard slapped Elias on the back, a heavy, patronizing strike. "Now you're getting it, son. Now you're seeing the world as it is, not as they teach it in Sunday school." "I am," Elias agreed softly. "I see it perfectly now. The architecture of your wealth is entirely untouchable by conventional means. You have proven that if the lie is grand enough, and the scotch is expensive enough, the world will simply look away." He turned slightly to look directly into Richard's eyes. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. For a fraction of a second, the mocking grin on Richard's face faltered, replaced by a flicker of primal, instinctual unease. There was something in Elias's eyes, a dark, quiet certainty, that didn't belong to a broken man. Elias turned to Valerie. She had stopped leaning on her hands. Her posture had gone rigid. She was too smart to miss the subtle undercurrent in his words, the precise, weighted cadence of his delivery. She recognized the scent of a trap, but the jaws hadn't snapped shut yet. "So," Elias said, raising the glass an inch higher, his voice ringing clear and absolute across the vast, opulent expanse of the boardroom. "Here is my toast to Sterling and Dupont, to the silent ledgers we keep, to the secrets we lock away in the dark. May the architecture of your empire receive exactly the scrutiny it deserves, and may the final balance, when it inevitably comes, be paid in full." He brought the glass to his lips and drank. The Macallan burned down his throat, a smooth, fiery line of liquid courage that settled warmly in his chest. For a long moment, the room was dead silent. The executives exchanged uncertain glances. The toast sounded like a compliment, an acknowledgement of their supremacy, yet it hung in the air with the ominous weight of a eulogy. Richard, recovering his bravado, barked a laugh and raised his own glass. "To the final balance," he echoed, missing the subtext entirely in his blind arrogance. The rest of the table followed suit, murmuring the words, clinking their glasses together in a discordant chime of crystal. They drank to their own invincibility. They drank to the ruin of their enemies. Elias lowered his empty glass and set it quietly onto the pristine mahogany surface. He did not sit back down. "If you'll excuse me," Elias said, buttoning his suit jacket, "I have some final files to process before the evening is over. The work of maintaining this empire never truly sleeps." "Go on, Vance," Richard dismissed him with a wave of his hand, already turning back to his sycophants. "Go crunch your numbers. We'll save you a bottle for the weekend." Elias turned and walked toward the heavy double doors of the boardroom. Every step felt lighter than the last. He felt Valerie's eyes burning a hole between his shoulder blades, her brilliant, paranoid mind frantically turning over his words, searching for the encrypted meaning he had hidden in plain sight. Let her search, he thought. By the time she figured it out, it would be far too late. He pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the quiet, sterile hallway of the 68th floor. The sound of the laughter was instantly muffled, sealed away in the mahogany tomb. Elias reached into his pocket and his fingers closed tightly around the cold, brass edge of the flash drive. The toast of ruin had been given. Now it was time to collect the debt. The rain drummed a relentless, chaotic rhythm against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 89th floor boardroom. Far below, Manhattan was nothing but a smear of bruised purples and wet neon. A world of the small and the struggling completely divorced from the air-conditioned, mahogany-paneled sanctuary of Sterling and Dupont. The air in the room was thick with the heavy, sweet scent of victory, underscored by the peaty aroma of 30-year-old single malt scotch and the faint, sulphurous ghost of a recently extinguished cohiba. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the 20-foot expanse of polished Brazilian rosewood, a monarch surveying his conquered realm. His suit, a bespoke charcoal armor that cost more than most cars, draped perfectly across his broad shoulders. His face was flushed, a mottled crimson map of arrogance and alcohol, as he held his crystal tumbler aloft, catching the warm, amber light of the chandelier. Beside him, Valerie Dupont lounged in her high-backed leather chair, her posture a masterclass in predatory relaxation. Her emerald-green silk blouse caught the light as she swirled the liquor in her glass, the ice clinking a steady, rhythmic chime. A smug, razor-thin smile played across her lips. They had won. The rigged victory was secured, the regulators were blind, and the firm's coffers were overflowing with the stolen futures of 10,000 unwitting retirees. At the absolute farthest end of the table, half swallowed by the shadows at the edge of the room, sat Elias Vance. He did not hold a glass. He did not share in the flushed, triumphant glow of the partners. He sat with his hands resting lightly on the closed lid of his slate-gray laptop, as still and silent as a statue in a graveyard. For 5 chapters of his life, Elias had been the invisible man. He had been the archivist, the shadow, the silent gear grinding away in the belly of the beast. He had endured the whispers in the sub-basement archives, navigated the mahogany mirage of their corporate culture, and risked everything to decrypt the master key. Now the ledger was open. And so, Sterling boomed, his baritone voice echoing off the sound-dampened walls. To the new era of Sterling and Dupont, we weathered the storm, we shed the dead weight, and we emerged untouchable. And a special toast. Sterling's eyes, bright and feral, locked onto the quiet man at the end of the table. To our loyal Elias. To the quiet men who keep the engine running while the captains steer the ship. Valerie chuckled, a dry, papery sound. To the quiet men, she echoed, raising her glass in a mocking salute. Elias looked at them. He felt no anger. The white-hot rage that had sustained him through the sleepless nights and the terrifying close calls had burned itself down to a cool, indestructible core of absolute resolve. "Thank you, Richard," Elias said. His voice was soft. It barely carried over the steady drumming of the rain against the glass. Yet, the sheer, unnatural calm of it seemed to ripple through the heavy air of the boardroom. It was a voice devoid of deference, stripped of the manufactured politeness that Sterling and Dupont demanded from their subordinates. It was the voice of a judge reading a verdict. Elias opened his laptop. The screen cast a pale, ghostly light across his sharp cheekbones. "I have always appreciated the firm's reliance on my discretion," Elias continued, his fingers drifting over the keyboard. "But I realized recently that keeping the engine running requires understanding exactly where the fuel comes from. And more importantly, where the exhaust is piped." Sterling frowned, lowering his glass a fraction of an inch. "What are you talking about, Elias? It's been a long week. Close the laptop. Have a drink." "I don't drink to illusions, Richard," Elias murmured. He pressed the enter key. The boardroom's ambient lighting instantly snapped off. The warm, amber glow was replaced by a harsh, blinding, clinical blue as the massive liquid crystal projector behind Sterling, usually reserved for dazzling shareholders with fabricated growth charts, roared to life. The sudden shift in light cast Sterling and Dupont in horrific spectral silhouettes. What the hell is this? Sterling snapped, shielding his eyes from the glare. Elias, turn that off. Elias ignored him. He tapped another key, and the blank blue canvas of the screen filled with cascading lines of raw, unredacted data. It was the silent ledger.
Astérisque Banque 6, Geneva.
Account 449, Alpha 7. Routing, *** Cayman Islands Monetary Authority. The Cypress Shell LLC, *** Blackwood Holdings. Transfer origin, Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. Status, laundered, ***. The numbers scrolled with terrifying speed, a digital waterfall of undeniable guilt. Dates, timestamps, IP addresses, offshore routing numbers, and the staggering multi-million-dollar sums that had been systematically siphoned, scrubbed, and hidden away. Every phantom LLC, every bribed auditor, every doctored balance sheet they thought they had buried in the archives was now projected in 10-foot-tall white font. Valerie Dupont stopped swirling her scotch. The glass slipped from her suddenly slack grip, hitting the rosewood table with a sharp crack. Amber liquid spilled across the polished wood, dripping onto her designer skirt, but she didn't even flinch. All the blood had vanished from her face, leaving her skin the color of wet chalk. Her eyes were wide, locked onto the screen as she recognized her own personal offshore account numbers flashing past. Where did you get this? Valerie whispered, her voice trembling, stripped entirely of its former predatory edge. That encryption was military grade. It was air-gapped. Air-gapped from the network, yes, Elias said, his voice still barely above a whisper, yet commanding the room entirely. But not from the archives. You left a physical paper trail for the encryption keys, Valerie. You were too paranoid to trust the cloud, so you trusted a vault. And you forgot who manages the vault. Sterling's face morphed from confusion to sheer, unadulterated panic, and finally, to desperate rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk collar. He slammed his fists down on the table, rattling the crystal decanter. You son of a bitch! Sterling roared, the sound desperate and hollow. You think this means anything? It's digital garbage. I'll have you destroyed, Vance. I will bury you so deep under litigation and NDA violations that you won't see daylight until you're 90. Turn it off. It's no longer mine to turn off, Elias said mildly. He tapped the spacebar. The massive projector screen bisected. The left side continued to scroll the damning financial logs. The right side shifted to a live, high-definition grid of the building's internal security cameras. Camera 01, the Grand Atrium Lobby. Camera 04, the underground parking garage. Camera 07, the executive elevator bank. Sterling and Dupont stared at the right side of the screen, the breath catching in their throats. Through the revolving glass doors of the ground floor lobby, figures were moving with terrifying, coordinated purpose. A fleet of black Suburbans had jumped the curb, their red and blue grille lights flashing aggressively in the rainy night, casting erratic reflections across the wet marble floors. Dozens of men and women wearing tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers flooded the atrium. Even through the grainy security feed, the bright yellow letters across their backs were unmistakable. FBI. The private security guards in the lobby. Men paid handsomely by Sterling to keep the riffraff out, took one look at the federal badges being thrust into their faces and immediately stepped aside, raising their hands in surrender. No, Sterling gasped, the word tearing from his throat as a pathetic, strangled wheeze. He stumbled backward, his legs giving way, and collapsed heavily into his chair. No. They can't. We have judges. We have senators. You bought senators with the money from the Cypress Shell, Elias corrected softly. I sent the unencrypted ledger to the SEC, the Justice Department, and the New York Times 20 minutes ago. Those senators are currently deleting your phone numbers from their contacts. Valerie began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved, her manicured hands clawing at her own collar as if the emerald silk was suddenly choking her. She looked wildly toward the boardroom doors, then to the floor-to-ceiling windows, trapped in a cage of glass and sky. The sheer altitude of their 89th floor sanctuary, which had once felt like Olympus, now felt like a terrifying precipice. There was nowhere to run. On the screen, the camera feeds updated. The FBI agents were swarming the executive elevators. The digital floor indicators on the security feed began to climb. Floor 20. Floor 45. Floor 60. Sterling leaped from his chair, a cornered, panicked animal. He lunged across the mahogany table toward Elias, his hands outstretched, knocking over chairs and shattering crystal. "I'll kill you. I'll kill you myself," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips, his eyes wide with a madness born of absolute ruin. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply reached out and closed his laptop. The projector screen remained locked on its damning display. The system was automated now, entirely out of Elias's hands. Sterling stopped mid-lunge, realizing that destroying the computer would do nothing to stop the inevitable. He fell to his knees on top of the rosewood table, surrounded by broken glass and spilled liquor, weeping openly, a broken king in a ruined castle. Floor 88. Floor 89. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the boardroom, broken only by Sterling's ragged sobbing and the relentless rain against the glass. Elias stood up. He buttoned his modest suit jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and looked at the two architects of so much invisible suffering. They looked small now, pathetic, stripped of their stolen wealth. They were nothing but frightened thieves waiting for the dark. "The loudest men in the room," Elias said, his soft voice cutting through the quiet like a scalpel. "Rarely hear the floorboards rotting beneath them." Out in the hallway, the heavy brass chime of the executive elevator rang out, a sharp, final note of doom. Elias Vance turned his back on the mahogany mirage, walking calmly toward the boardroom doors as the heavy, authoritative pounding of federal agents echoed through the glass. He had spoken his piece, and the ledger would never be silent again.